This program is designed to provide general information with regards to the subject matters covered. This information is given with the understanding that neither the hosts, guests, sponsors, or station are engaged in rendering any specific and personal, medical, financial, legal, counseling, professional service, or any advice. You should seek the services of competent professionals before applying or trying any suggested ideas.
Good morning, true seekers and true crime junkies. Welcome back to another episode of Hit the Road Jack, Finding the Zodiac. I have news today. We are one less commentator. I want to have our thoughts and prayers to go out to our code solver, Harriette Sucher. Turns out that she was in a hit and run accident this last Monday, crossing a crosswalk. She was hit by a truck and she has been in the ICU and in the hospital ever since. She will be being moved to a recovery station where she can literally recover from her accident. And I just wanted to give a shout out to her because this really sucks during the holiday season, which, by the way, this is our Christmas episode. So I'm rocking the Christmas pajamas. When I see you guys back, Christmas will be over, and I hope that you all had a wonderful holiday. So I'm going to just start out really at this point. I wanted to give a shout out to the website that has been formed by Talk4TV, which is www.findingthezodiacradio.com. You can go there and find all the episodes in order, which I know sometimes people find it a little complicated to do when they're on YouTube unless they subscribe to the channel, in which case they would come up in chronological order. But here you can find all the episodes we're at what now, 157? Just gotta love this. So with that being said, I thought I was going to actually start out with the fourth part of the solve, which is the ghost killer letter involved in the Atlanta, Georgia child killer cases. However, Harriet is not with us, and I'm not going to make much sense out of her solves. So we will wait till she comes back to do that. Maybe a couple weeks. I'm not sure. So I'm just going to scream right on past that. And that actually brings us to the additional places that Jack would take the kids camping. And during this time frame, like I said, Atlanta, Georgia child killer is beginning to kick off. And Dennis is telling us a little bit of the story about what's going on at this time. So I'm going to read an excerpt from his book. He said, if Jack was killing during this time, let's just stop that. He said, if Jack was killing during this time, when did he have time to do these murders without my mother's okay, this is his printing in his book. I'm trying to speak it the way it's written, and I'll try to correct it if I can when I get there. Without my mother's wondering where he was. I remembered when he had the perfect opportunity. All 6 of us lived in that small camp trailer for almost 2 years. In 1979, 1980, and 1981, Jack would frequently take my friend Joe Williams and I camping, sometimes for a week at a time. We used to go to Loon Lake. It was a couple hours drive from Sacramento. So Chiquito Creek was one, and now Loon Lake I have up over here. This is actually mapping out Chiquito Creek here, it looks like. So very close to the Nevada border. Let's see. It was a couple hours drive from Sacramento. I remember after we got camp set up, Jack would leave for a couple days and Joe and I would stay at camp. I never asked Jack where he would go. I just liked the fact that Joe and I could do whatever we wanted while he was gone. Jack didn't go back home, and my mother never knew he left. If anybody ever questioned Jack about his whereabouts, he was camping with Joe and I. These camping excursions were frequent during this time. Jack could have been doing or planning his next murder during those days. He left Joe and I alone, and nobody would have suspected a thing. Another thing that comes to mind is how Jack would always have to pinpoint our specific spot on the map by using an AM radio. He would find the direction of 2 AM stations by turning the radio until the station was gone. Then he would use a compass and find magnetic north, and where the 2 lines came together would be our location. That's an extremely unique way of traveling tracking, but it really kind of proves the orienteering that we know that Jack was capable of, especially as it applies to something like the Mount Diablo map, where it's explicitly stated magnetic north. So that kind of gives me goosebumps, because it makes me feel like Dennis is really kind of honing in on some of the skills that the Zodiac had that Jack also had. Another excerpt from the particular book is, I would later learn that the geographical part of the Zodiac case would be the most important aspect. In 1980, while still living in our travel trailer, Jack's biological daughter from his first wife moves in next to us in her own trailer. Shortly after she moved in, Jack was at her trailer and was choking her. He had both hands around her neck and she went unconscious. She came to a while later. In 1981, Jack's biological son from his first wife passed away at age 28. This had a big effect on Jack. This is the same year that the Zodiac murders stopped, according to Graysmith. This is when Jack stopped drinking for almost 20 years. In 1982, Jack and my mother separated, and Jack went back to Texas to be with his mother. My younger sisters went to Michigan to live with our real father, and my mother, Charles, and I moved into an apartment in Fair Oaks. So there's a couple things that are going on here, and I know these years are a little bit ahead of their times, but it is just part of the paragraph in his book. But we're getting that reference back to Michigan again. So I had explained before that Nora had family in Michigan when they were living in Minnesota, and it was a very short trip when you consider how far Jack would actually drive at any given point in time to travel the country. I would want to say it was about 12 hours was the shortest way from Minnesota to Michigan, where the family lived, and put Jack in proximity with the Oakland County child murders. So that brings us to the next murder, which on July 6th of 1979, we have Santa Rosa Jane Doe near Calistoga Road, where Lori Lee Cursa's body was found. So clearly we have somebody coming back and repeatedly dumping bodies in the same area, which is why it was probably connected, or at least thought to be the same killer, because they're dumping in the same spot. It says that remains that were found were just bones, still wrapped in loops of rope. The victim had been tied in the same fashion as Walsh had been, hog-tied with a rope running from her ankles to her neck. And again, Jack grew up on a farm, and hog-tying was something he knew a lot about. He even actually, when he traveled when he was younger from ranch to ranch via the railway, he ended up on a pig farm at one point in time. This would have slowly strangled her to death, with her hands tied and pulled down between her legs as if to hog tie. It appeared as though she had been buried or dumped in the type of duffel or laundry bag, possibly like those used by commercial lending companies. Again, Jack worked for South Lake Tahoe Linen Company. So we have this laundry bag again, which we heard that was mentioned in the Oakland County child murders as a way to travel or bring the children up to the apartment that he and the supposed acquaintance was in. The grommets from the mouth of the bag were found with the bones. White cotton clothesline had been used to bound the victim. Ankles pulled to her neck with 4 cords wrapped around her neck equals kind of a ranch knowledge of a slowly hog-tied death. Grommets were found like those found at the top of laundry bags for linen companies, or maybe even military grommets for their bags. So we just already talked about Oakland County child killer accomplice letter, wrote that he brought the kids up in laundry hampers. So some of this stuff is closely connected. Another interesting statement that by Dennis is that he could not have known to be true of many of these crimes is the use of the white nylon rope clothesline that has been a continuing MO in almost all the crimes I write about in this presentation. Again, Dewhurst writes, and that's Stephen Dewhurst, and I believe it was the Southwest Wind, Demon of the Southwest Wind or something like that. He wrote in there, he always had that stuff with him, that damned map, compass, and radio, and he pulled it out all the time. It was like a little game he played when we were out driving around. The other thing he always had were links of nylon rope about 18 inches long. Jack never talked to me about what he had done with that, and that was per Dennis in Stephen's book. Now we're going to start to see the entrance of the Atlanta, Georgia child killer. It begins in July of 1979. On July 21st of 1979, we have Edward Hope Smith, who's 14 years old, from Atlanta. She is murdered. I do not have a lot of information on these individuals. I did put it in where I did have information. So some of these I'm just going to be able to tell you about who was killed and not necessarily the style or the MO that was included. On July 25th of 1979, Alfred Evans, 14 years old, also killed in Atlanta. Then we have a nice big jump from July to September. And the fact that these are all within days of each other is really what kind of mesmerized me, especially when we consider Dennis stating that Jack would take and drop him and his friend off camping and be gone for a few days, sometimes up to a week. And each of these are happening almost in sets within days of each other. And then we don't see anything happen again for several months. So it picks back up in September 4th of 1979 with Milton Harvey, who's 14 years old, and he was going to the bank in Atlanta, Georgia, when he was kidnapped. On September 7th of 1979, Licia Michelle Jackson at Lake Wildwood subdivision in Conroe, Texas, was murdered. And sometimes to me, this was kind of I kind of almost feel like it was a way that these different serial killing sprees were occurring, almost as if we had different serial killers out there. But the possibility of it having been one who was perpetrating these crimes to make it look like these serial killers were still existing in their areas is where I look at this one in September 4th of 1979 on the way back through Texas to California on September 7th of 1979 with the Jackson murder is very plausible that this is just another murder he perpetrates on his way back. So landing in Atlanta, Georgia for one, coming back through Texas, we get another one. And then once he's back in California, we see another murder in California. It says Licia Jackson was 12 years of age and resided with her parents inside the Lake Wildwood subdivision of FM 1485 in Conroe. She had attended Washington Junior High. Licia Jackson had been swimming in the subdivision lake with friends and relatives about her same age. So we have relation again to a waterway. Licia Jackson was last seen walking alone on Creek Bend Street in the direction of a residence. Her relatives arrived at Jackson's home a short time later, and her parents inquired about her absence. A search of the neighborhood began and lasted through the evening. The following day, Licia's eyeglasses were found at the intersection of Creekwood and Deep Forest within the subdivision. On September 13th of 1979, an oil field worker found Licia Jackson's remains in a heavily wooded area along a pipeline of Exxon Road in Conroe. This scene was approximately 5 miles from Lake Wildwood. An autopsy determined that Licia Jackson had been sexually assaulted and murdered. In September 26th of 1979, 22-year-old Tammy Vincent from Blackie's Pasture, Tiburon, California. So this is the location, or they are finding the body of Tammy Vincent. So I do not believe that this is the date that she was actually murdered. I believe that she went missing previous to this, but here's the information that we were able to obtain on it. It is on the Sandy Betts murder map, and we talked about the Tiburon reference that is made in the 1968 letters to the draft, or the Dear Draft Board letters. Says the charred remains of a girl found shot and stabbed to death near Blackie's Pasture in Tiburon 28 years ago have been identified as those of a Washington teenager slain weeks before she was due to testify in an organized crime case. So this one has sent my ears up because, of course, this is all surrounding the things that I believe that Jack's involved with. The victim's identity remained a mystery for years until DNA database analysis in February identified her as Tammy Vincent, 17, a runaway who worked in a sex trade establishment owned by a man known as a local godfather. Marin County Sheriff's Detective Steve Nash said the positive identification was made in February after DNA extracted from a 3-centimeter strand of pubic hair matched DNA samples from Vincent's mother and sister at a private DNA lab at the University of Texas in 2005. Marin investigators are pursuing suspects they believe stabbed Vincent more than 40 times in the chest with an ice pick. Now, we've talked about ice picks. If you followed this podcast, you're going to see other references to being stabbed directly in the heart a single time with a very small, either 3-inch knife or an ice pick. And it seems to be that running MO again. She was also shot in the head, and then they burned her body beyond recognition with acid on a Tiburon beach. Vincent's upper torso and her face were disfigured by the burns. When you think that this case is nearly 30 years old, and then to be able to identify the person, that's just unbelievable, Marin County Sheriff Robert Doyle said. Not only does it further an ongoing criminal investigation, it gives a sense of closure to the family of this young lady. It's not a happy ending, but at least they know. I'm confident we'll ultimately be able to make some arrests and bring those responsible to justice. After the DNA match was made, Marin authorities formed a team to investigate the unsolved murder. They have canvassed the country, interviewing possible witnesses and others they believe may have been involved. No arrests have been made. Some of the burned evidence from the crime scene was useless to authorities. However, a bullet was recovered. Authorities declined to identify the type or caliber of the gun used, and Tammy Vincent had a gunshot wound to her head. The Vincent match was made through CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system used in missing persons and other investigations by nearly 200 law enforcement agencies across the nation. Most of the physical and biological evidence in the case had deteriorated after sitting in evidence lockers in Tiburon and at the sheriff's office for more than 25 years, but the root and shaft of the hair found during the autopsy remained viable and provided the key DNA material. Before being uploaded to CODIS, DNA profiles must be developed through mitochondrial and nuclear DNA. Mitochondrial DNA is inherited from the mother and is generally found in hair, bones, and teeth. Nuclear DNA comes from both parents and is found in a wider array of sources. DNA testing of skeletal remains is among the most difficult things to do in forensic science just by the mere nature of the samples, said John Tonkin, director of the Missing Persons Program at the State's Department of Justice DNA Lab in Richmond. The real key to unlocking this case was all the additional evidence gathered and retained under proper conditions. The identification was absolutely critical to furthering the investigation. It was stalled until the body was identified. Senior criminalist Amy Hoover, who works at the Richmond DNA Lab, compiled 2 binders of data during her work with Nash and the sheriff's office on the Vincent case. For this one case, we'll have 20 more that we never are able to make an identification, Hoover said. We were lucky that there wasn't we were lucky that the area wasn't burnt and we had good pubic hair. The body of Vincent was discovered by a jogger the morning of September 26, 1979 at Richardson Bay Park at the end of Greenwood Beach Road. A witness reported seeing a bonfire on the beach just after 3 a.m. Several hours later, Tiburon detectives who arrived at the scene found Vincent's crumpled body. An ice pick and acetone were found nearby. A bullet was recovered. Without any leads, authorities buried her body in an unmarked grave at Valley Memorial Park in Nevada on December 12, 1979. Her remains were exhumed twice, the first time in June 2002 so authorities could extract DNA samples from her skeletal remains, but authorities were only able to develop a partial profile and the DNA was of no use. On August 7th, her body was exhumed again so her remains could be cremated and returned to Washington, where a small private funeral was held 3 days later for family and friends. This has been an extremely emotional time for me, said Nash, who was assigned the case in 2001. Finally, after all these years, we've been able to bring this girl home to her family. The victim's younger sister, Sandy Vincent, 44, seeks justice. For me, it's closure on one chapter, but another one remains open, Vincent said. The story is still ongoing. I can't believe she was murdered and that someone is getting away with it. I would really like to see them pay for what they have done. Authorities declined to identify the city in which the Vincent family lives, fearing possible retaliation against them. Marin authorities are working with King County, Washington, law enforcement officials to track down suspects in the case. Officials believe Tammy Vincent was working at a Seattle area adult entertainment establishment when she was picked up during a raid along with several others about a month before she was murdered. It is believed that Vincent was transferred to California to work at the Palace Theater on Turk Street in San Francisco before she could testify in a federal case in King County. Vincent was last seen with a Caucasian male at a Woolworths store at Powell and Market Streets in San Francisco. The Woolworths comes to mind because we know that there was paper that was used in the series of communications, which I believe are attributed to the Zodiac, and it was on paper that was purchased at Woolworth. So again, just another one of those connectivities. The night before she was murdered, investigators say the ice pick and the acetone found at the murder scene were purchased at Woolworths as well, which closed several years ago. Investigators were able to trace the sales clerk who handled the original transaction. When Vincent's body was discovered, she was wearing tan pants, a black short sleeve shirt with the yellow halter top underneath, and expensive light brown high heels from Italy. Even in death, she was clean and neat and looking like a young, innocent victim, Nash said. She wasn't living like some homeless person. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children developed a composite photograph based on her partially burned face. Mill Valley forensic artist Gloria Nuss of Mill Valley helped with the reconstruction of the girl's head and hair. Authorities believe Vincent worked for Joe Wiley Brown, a man Seattle officials described as a local godfather who ran Seattle area adult entertainment businesses. He was later convicted on federal racketeering charges along with an ex-cop for prostitution, arson, loan sharking, and extortion, according to Washington state court records. In February of 2003, DNA from Vincent's family was collected and submitted by Washington officials for analysis in connection with the Green River serial killer case. Washington officials sought to identify young women murdered in the Green River area south of Seattle. On November 5th of 2003, Gary Ridgway pleaded guilty to 48 counts of murder, including 42 of the 49 Green River victims. Seattle authorities compared Tammy Vincent's partial DNA profile with the remains of 4 unidentified Green River bodies, but no match was found. Then, in February of this year, Tammy Vincent's DNA profile was uploaded by the Richmond lab into the FBI's National Missing Persons database, and a tentative match was made. By the end of the month, Marin authorities confirmed that the unidentified body found in Tiburon was Tammy Vincent. The use of DNA in criminal cases came into use by police agencies in the late 1980s and early 1990s. About a year after being assigned to the case, Marin authorities began to develop a DNA profile using bones and other evidence. However, much of the evidence was useless because the skeletal remains had deteriorated, but a hair sample preserved following an autopsy held the DNA that made that match. Hoover, who works at the state's DNA lab in Richmond, called Nash to inform him of the database hit. Within hours, Nash was on an airplane headed to Washington State to deliver the news to her family. It's absolutely amazing, Tiburon Police Captain Dave Hutton said, when you come across a case over that amount of time, to finally bring this young lady to a proper resting place where her family knows and there's a sense of closure, that to me is just mind-boggling. Says last month, cemetery workers exhumed the body from the grave 1932-4 in the Garden of Devotion at Valley Memorial Park in Novato. On an overcast day, Nash gathered Vincent's remains from the grave. The next day, her remains were cremated. 2 days later, Nash and Detective Jim Hickey arrived in Washington with an urn containing Vincent's ashes. It was the focal point of a family memorial service at Ephrata Cemetery in Ephrata, Washington. Sandy Vincent was almost too overwhelmed to speak. More than 27 years after Tammy was killed, Sandy delivered an emotional goodbye to her sister at the gathering. We could have done a lot of things together as sisters do, she said last month. She could have had a family, and I know she had a career she wanted to pursue. Sandy Vincent said her sister wanted to become a nurse. I know she wanted to come home, Vincent said. She just didn't get the chance. How could anyone who possibly could have done this live without having any sort of guilt? I would very much like to have justice. So that brings us to a murder on September 26th of 1979, 18 to 20-year-old female in Tiburon, California, dumped on the beach in an area frequented by joggers, stabbed repeatedly, shot in the head, face and upper torso mutilated by burns never identified. So I'm sorry, this is when the body of Tammy was found, was September 26th of 1979, and these are some of the recreations that those recreation artists had completed. And I think ultimately in the end that this is actually the picture of Tammy Vincent. The interesting note, this murder is connected to the Green River killer, Gary Ridgway, since Tammy was purportedly part of a sex scheme and moved to San Francisco in order to testify in a federal case for King County. King County is where the Green River killings occurred in Seattle, Washington area. However, this murder took place in California. So while Ridgway confesses to 71 murders, he is only linked to 4 by DNA and leads officials in exchange for a plea deal to the graves of 3 others. I'm just confused because why would he not have taken them to all 71 if he's admitting to 71? So is he just overly taking culpability for many more crimes like we've seen with Henry Lee Lucas that he didn't actively commit, but he's being talked into taking the rap for those? I'm not sure if there were names provided and how they came to the conclusion there was 71 unless he could have identified these particular murders. Let's see here. And why would he have not taken them to all 71 if his deal was life in prison instead of the death penalty? Again, doesn't make any sense. You're being given the opportunity to not suffer the death penalty. Why not admit to all of them? So I felt like there was something going on here, and it makes me wonder if Ridgway isn't just the fall guy for a larger story like Henry Lee Lucas. Unidentified helper from Albion, California supports the likeness of the Green River Killer to the Zodiac Killer and the occult relationship, which includes Aleister Crowley and the Rosicrucians. Now, I know that the Rosicrucians was something that Stephen Dewhurst heavily hit on in his book. I'm not sure if that is really kind of up the alley that we're going on to, but I know that Harriette had also at some point in time began speaking about the Rosicrucians and the relation to the Pope or to the Catholic religion. So maybe there is something there behind it. It's just not an avenue or a hole that this rabbit's gone down. It looks like I took this particular next murder out because it has been attributed to Joseph DeAngelo, the Golden State Killer and Bay Area rapist, but it is on October 1st of 1979. I originally had it in here because I do see that there is a Southern California relation to the murders as we talked about in the Black Dahlia cases and so forth. And this is actually one of the pathways that Jack would take out of California when he was on his way to either Arizona, Texas, or any of the southern states. It shows that they were tied up, but scarred off by the females. I'm sorry. The couple was tied up, but the suspect was scared off by the female's screams. Attacks near a neighbor who is an FBI agent. The FBI agent describes the perp that got away. The friendly murder couple and 2 other Goleta couples in 1230-79 are, again, close MOs to what we saw here with these 2 individuals that survived. The East Area rapist and the original Night Stalker from Goleta murders are one and the same person per law enforcement and the DNA tests. Crime stopped in 1986. And again, this crime has been associated with Joseph DeAngelo, so I have, for the time being, crossed that one out, though I still have to keep in the back of my mind Jack stating that he knows that there are people who have taken the rap for him, whether it was them actively taking the rap or it was them just being the fall guy or the patsy. On October 8th of 1979, Molly Voinovich in Cleveland, Ohio. Now, this is Senator George Voinovich's 9-year-old daughter was struck by a van and killed a few days after the primary elections. So this brings me right back to Harriette right now at this point, because of course she just moved to the Ukiah area. She'd only been there but a couple weeks, and she finds herself in a hit and run accident. She did inform me yesterday that they did actually catch and arrest the individual who ran from the scene, but it was all kind of relative. And interestingly enough, it happens at a time when I'm going to be sharing this information with you about Voinovich's daughter. Was this meant to halt the campaign of Senator Voinovich? But it didn't. So he actually continued to run and won. The suspect that hit her was apprehended and convicted, but was he part of some group to kind of stifle Voinovich's endeavors? Voinovich will start to receive taunting letters very similar to the Zodiac Killers, along with memorabilia in those letters that are consistent with things that we see from the Zodiac Killer in the Halloween card. And we'll be talking about that when we get to those communications. Let's see. So it says on October 8th, 1979, a few days after the primary, Voinovich's 9-year-old daughter, Molly, was struck by a van and killed. The event brought the Voinovich campaign to a virtual halt and made it difficult for Kucinich to attack his opponent. Still, he challenged Voinovich to a series of debates in various Cleveland neighborhoods. And again, this is Cleveland, Ohio, you guys. So you have to remember we have communications that are in the FBI FOIA files that indicates Zodiac-style letters were mailed to Ohio. Voinovich declined the invitation, saying the debates would be unproductive, but they did debate on November 3rd at the City Club. Voinovich won the election with 94,541 votes to Kucinich, 73,755 votes. On October 1979, I see a piece of mail that is in Jack's belongings, which actually confirms the location that Dennis Kaufman speaks about, which is that trailer park that they lived in for the 2 years in the Sacramento area. It's on Auburn Boulevard, and it eventually actually becomes the FBI Sacramento field office. And I thought that, what a coincidence. So when I mapped it out, and I have it here on the map, we can actually see the area in which the mobile home park, and back then I'm really not sure, obviously. I might get my, oh, there it goes. Back then, we're looking at a current map of today's street makeup. So I don't know that back in that day that there wasn't actually a combination of this entire area, which was actually a mobile home park. But we do see that this right here on Orange Grove and Auburn Boulevard is the location of the field office of the FBI. On October 21st, 1979, we see the Atlanta, Georgia child killer strike again with Yusuf Bell. He was going to the store. He was getting into a blue car in Atlanta. Kind of reminds me of that blue gremlin reference in the Oakland County child murders, but it doesn't state what type of car. He had been strangled and abandoned in E.P. Johnson Elementary School. That to me was again reference to a president, as seen in many of these cases with the postage and other school dump signs that are named after presidents or Benjamin Franklin, and Bush with the Humble, Texas reference, which is right next to Bush International Airport. So I just kept putting these pieces together as a method of operation because it seemed that it was right up that alley. October 21st of 1979, Mary Bennett in San Francisco, California. This would be after returning, obviously, to California. She was stabbed more than 25 times in the back, neck, and face. Again, complete overkill like we saw in the Sherry Jo Bates case. She was buried in a gully north of Lincoln Park Golf Course's third hole. And of course, this brings us back to Blue Rock Springs and the golf course murders that was associated with the Zodiac killer. On November 1979, found in New York, Livingston County, Tammy Jo Alexander from Florida and a runaway went missing in 1977, but was found in November of 1979. On December 2nd of 1979, we actually have the Times Square killer. And the reason why this one got put into the presentation is because they were missing heads and hands. The bathtub was used to clean them. I did list myself to research this, and I do believe that I watched a documentary on these particular murders. The fact that the heads and hands were never found, but then we start actually finding skulls and hands in other locations, again, brings us back to murders we just talked to you about last week, in which case teeth that did not belong to victims found in shallow graves were found in those graves with those victims, and it did not belong to them. So we have that crossing over again of a repeated burial or location of a previous victim with the remains of another victim. And we actually, like I said, we're going to see that happening in the I-45 cases as we move on through this presentation. I have Carl Wilson on there, but I'm not sure why. Another one that I X'd out as being related to the Golden State Killer, which was on December 30th of 1979, Robert Offerman and Deborah Manning in Goleta, San Diego area. It was a home invasion like the other Goleta, Texas, and Lipstick, John Benet Ramsey. They were shot to death after being tied up. Killer brought white German Shepherd with him to the killing, and the dog was missing one toe. Broke into a vacant house next door and stole a bicycle. And that is going to bring, I have bicycle references with Arizona, Atlanta, Goleta. The East Area rapist and the original Night Stalker from Goleta murders are one and the same person, once again, per law enforcement and the DNA tests. The crime stopped in 1986. I'll try not to keep rereading that, but I have notated each one of these murders that were associated with him. Recent discovery in match and DNA has yielded Sacramento County a suspect named Joseph James D'Angelo, 72 years of age and former police officer. 4/26/2018, press release, Sheriff Scott Jones, DA Sacramento County, and more officials. It is interesting that I'd already excluded this case as a possible for Jack, but I just want to note that we're, again, that 6 degrees, 2 degrees, whatever they say it is, we are from anything. Joseph D'Angelo actually worked with one of my great girlfriends I've known for more than 30 years at Save Mart. She worked with him for 12 years. He was a mechanic there on the trucks and big rigs that she drives, and she spent many occasions fishing with him and enjoying his company, and would never have picked up on the fact that he hated women or otherwise. Aw, I love you, Harriette Sucher. I just got a message from her. It says, I'm here in the hospital listening to the show. You go, girl. We're reaching out to you. We love you. We hope you heal soon. Can't wait to have you back and continue on with the wonderful solves that you've been coming up with. All right. That brings us to winter, March of 1980, so this picture is only listed 80 on the back. So it occurred in 1980. And when I look at the trees around it, we're either just before spring or right after fall. So that's why I listed March or November of 1980, because that could really only be the two possibilities for having bare trees in the background. We see pictures of Butch and Terry's wedding in Reno, Nevada. Surroundings appear to be either early 1980 before bloom or late 1980 after fall. 1980, Jack's daughter moved into the trailer space, as we had heard Dennis talk about on Auburn Boulevard. And we know that, again, I mean, there's really nobody off limits to Jack in this family. I've heard from his ex-wife, who indicated he attempted to smother her with a pillow. Now we're hearing Dennis recall a story about Jack strangling his daughter. Dennis believes that Jack was ultimately responsible for killing his mother in the end. We know that he killed several family pets, and we know that he was an avid hunter of small and large game. So this man, again, nobody was not on his list in terms of what he might do to actually harm or kill something. I do need to do some research on this, but I thought it was worth putting in here. In 1981, a possible murder time frame. This was provided to me by Moonlight. She used to be around. Again, she felt like she had been so invaded and her systems had been hacked, and that people were literally trying to take down all the research that she's done. I was able to keep some of that research and enter it into the PowerPoint presentation. So this was not my find, which is why I really probably should have done the research before now, but I really don't find a lot on these old murders. So sometimes it just seems futile to go through the internet for hours and hours looking for something I'm just not going to find. It says the murder of an Arizona Deborah Carrick. Her belongings were brought back to hitchhiker killer body dump site to frame the Zodiac MK Manali, the Imperial, as she called it. So I don't know if you guys remember the personal ad that we talked about quite some time ago, in which case it was reaching out to Zodiac, but it also talked about other signs of what astrology puts out there. Libra, I think it was, and then there was one other, but also the Imperial, as if to say something related to like the KKK, which is something that Harriette Sucher has brought up in some of those communications as solves. So Moonlight is saying that it was to frame Manali and Anderson, which both purportedly had committed self-murder. Manali worked for a temp period at San Quentin. Did he help spring the Angwin brothers with KO and Golden Sturgill, which mysteriously died in 1975, which is Kim's biological dad. I'm not sure who she's referring to as Kim, but between 74 and 76 seems to be all the ZKMKs die, leaving the master. And I think that she again is referring to others that are in the group. Who is the ZKMK Ultra? I don't know, but she did list a URL, it looks like here. So Veteran Doe is this individual that we're going to talk about right now. John Doe from Napa, California. John Doe was found, I believe, at Mount Veeder, California. It says race was white, sex was male, couldn't estimate the weight, height was in inches, 68 estimated, hair color possibly brown, eye color unknown or missing. Circumstances, probable year of death was 1981 to 1982, estimated post-mortem interval 15 years. It says skeletal remains found on a secluded hillside residence while property was being surveyed for new owner. Scene appeared to be at least 10 to 15 years old. Skeletal remains spread out over 100 feet on hillside down a deer trail. Evidence of animal bites to the skull. The Ruger Bearcat 22 caliber revolver discovered under the body. Gun traced to burglary in Arizona. So now we have this crisscrossing, and I think that's why she put in here the murder of Deborah Carrick from Arizona. So it's possible that that murder took place in Arizona with Deborah Carrick, and this gun was then stolen while the suspect was in Arizona and then came back to California and committed a murder with that. It says a Smirnoff vodka bottle and Budweiser beer cans also were on the scene. Dates on the bottle and cans were allotted to 1981. The 22 caliber ammo found in a handmade leather backpack. So again, handmade items are something we see that Jack is very good at doing. Single gunshot wound found on the right side of the head. Lower jaw was missing. Numerous bones found, but not a complete skeleton. Totality of circumstances during the investigation led investigators to believe that this was a suicide by handgun. However, well, then it would suggest that he was also the person who committed the murder in Arizona and stole that gun, but then why come back to California and commit suicide? Other distinctive physical characteristics, calcium buildup on one leg bone recovered led anthropologists to believe that the decedent might have ridden horses. Very interesting. John Doe, California, 26 to 32 years old, white male, located on October 17th, 1997 in Mount Veeder, Napa County, California. Dental work makes them believe the man was affluent or in the military. Possible connections to Phoenix, Arizona area and horse riding. Additional information says Mount Veeder man or Napa John Doe was an adult male discovered in California in 1997. He is believed to be deceased for several years prior to his discovery, and his death may have occurred as early as 1980. His cause of death was a gunshot. However, authorities do not know if it was due to homicide or suicide, and the gallery exclusions of John Phillips. I'm not sure why she put that in there either. Sometimes I do wish that Moonlight was still around with us so that she could explain some of this stuff to me. Anyways, we do have a picture of Jack in 1980. I look at this picture and I just don't even recognize this man. He looks so different from one era to the next, as if he's ever changing his looks. March 4th of 1980, Angel Lanier, 12 years old, in Atlanta, Georgia. So now this is our next murder back in the Atlanta, Georgia killings. It's the first female victim of this series, strangled and tied to a tree and possibly sexually assaulted with an object. On March 11 of 1980, Jeffrey Mathis disappeared and was never found, from Atlanta, Georgia. Again, we have another one of the the Golden State Killers, which was on March 13th of 1980. I always led into this because it always appeared when, like I said, when the murder in Atlanta, Georgia happened, that we would shortly after see something happen in Texas and then back in California again, as if he was making his travel back through and up to Northern California. On April 24th of 1980, Robin Brooks in Sacramento, California was murdered. She was 20 years old, found murdered in her apartment. She worked for a donut shop on Kiefer Boulevard and Tallahassee Drive, near Power Inn Dumps, and it is on the murder map of Sandy Betts. And then we had a slew of murders that occurred in Atlanta back to back, basically. It looks like May 18th of 1980, we had Eric Middlebrooks in Atlanta. On June 9th of 1980, Chris Richardson disappeared and was never found in Atlanta. June 22nd of 1980, LaTanya Wilson disappeared in Atlanta. June 23rd of 1980, Aaron Wyke disappeared in Atlanta. So very busy month in June for the Atlanta, Georgia child killer. July 6th of 1980, Anthony Carter was murdered in Atlanta, and July 8th of 1980. So again, very close in time frame. 23-year-old Barbara Gail Witten New Caney, Texas, off Roman Forest Boulevard. Black female burned in a wooded area, shot multiple times with a .22 caliber firearm. So now we can see again the shooting and the burning of the bodies, these things that are really kind of overlapping with the MOs. So either this is just the way the mob got down, or this is the way the Zodiac got down. 2 white males were seen at the scene putting something in the truck of a medium blue Chevy Nova with 2 navy blue racing stripes. So again, we're back to of that blue vehicle that was spoken about in some of the earlier Atlanta cases, with one final murder on July, not final, but at least for the month, July 30th of 1980, Earl Terrell was murdered in Atlanta. Then we have coming back into California, again, something that is associated to the Golden State Killer on August 8th of 1980 in the Dana Point, San Diego area. On August 20th of 1980, we see the murders pick back up again in Atlanta with Clifford Jones. On August 26th, we have Rhonda Michelle Baylock in North Carolina, again picked up in a blue Chevy with a white camper shell. Now, we know that Jack owned a blue pickup truck with a white camper shell, so that's likely why I threw this one in, but I don't have any information that supports he was in Northern California. Again, sometimes these end up in the presentation simply because they are unsolved, and everything should be considered no matter how far apart they are and no matter what the time frame is, because we know that Jack was all over the United States. Another murder occurs in Atlanta, Georgia, child killer on September 14th of 1980, which is Darren Glass in Atlanta. And then on October 9th, 1980, Charles Stevens was killed in Atlanta. In November 1st of 1980, so following the Atlanta murders, we have a 14 to 17-year-old Jane Doe, number 1. It's a Texas murder found dumped along I-45 about 5 miles north of Huntsville, strangled with pantyhose and was found nude. Bite marks were on her body. Now, this is out of character for the Zodiac killer. I mean, clearly we've not heard anything like this up to this point. But we do know that in the Black Dahlia and several of the other murders, there were mutilations that took place. So I put nothing past this person. The body was 5 foot 4 inches, 110 pounds, and brown hair. Then in November 1st of 1980, we have Aaron Jackson in Atlanta, Georgia. And then I wrote down probably not Jack on November 9th of 1980, Valerie McDonald in San Francisco, found in British Columbia, Canada. There has been a Canadian connection that I hadn't found yet with the Zodiac and the Tim Miller letter. But now we're starting to see that Canadian connection after I've done some more research. Philip A. Thompson was a possible Jack associate. She was told that they could get her into the movies, and it is not on the murder map of Sandy Betts. On November 10th of 1980, we have Patrick Rogers, again killed in Atlanta, Georgia. And then I had an interesting, it looks like a letter that was sent, or at least a notification sent by an attorney in regards to one of Jack's relatives. And the reason why I found it interesting is because we show Jack Terrence on here twice. One is being deceased and one is being alive. And we're going to explain that information because the addresses are not making any sense to me. November 15th of 1980, Jack's relative Lena Adair dies in New Mexico. And maybe this is that New Mexico connection with the Constellation Mountains. Dennis used to tell me about that Jack had taken off for a month at a time to Oklahoma to buy pot. He also had gone into the Constellation Mountains in New Mexico, I believe it was, with 2 individuals. And Jack chuckles when he says only 2 of us came out. So as if to say they killed somebody in that particular area. Well, it looks like I'm down to about my last minute. Well, it says I've got another minute and 2 minutes and some seconds. Let me see if I can make it through this. So it actually shows that there is a living cousin called Jack Terrence on Route 1, Wheeling, Oklahoma. And I thought that was odd because we know that the only other Jack Terrence was Jack's father, who had long passed. I mean, he died when Jack was 12. So they couldn't have been referring to Jack the father. They must be referring to Jack Terrence, and they list an address for him currently in 1980 at Wellington, Oklahoma. When I questioned Dennis about that, that's when he said that Jack would take off for a month at a time to go to Oklahoma to buy pot, and that is likely where maybe he picked it up. I'm not sure. The letter on this is postmarked October 1980 from Bobby Lyons' estate. October 1980, Jack's residence is still the 4428 Auburn Boulevard, verified by the attorney who mailed him in regards to being an heir and by a neighbor who gave an interview on Jack. Ancestry.com also shows Jack here in 1981. So we do have enough information to show that he was in the place that Dennis was talking about. I think at this point, I'm probably going to, well, let me see. We'll talk about real quick. Jack W. Terrence is now listed as a deceased cousin, but it shows his address at 4428 Auburn Boulevard. So I'm not sure if this was just a clerical error because J.W. Terrence was Jack's father. He was in fact deceased, but he couldn't have currently been living in Auburn Boulevard in 1980. So I'm not sure where the disconnect happened in this information, but clearly this attorney has reached out to both locations and even sent a letter to the address where the deceased cousin lived. So again, I'm just a little confused by the information, but it definitely shows that we have Jack wandering around the United States. So I think that's about all we have for today, you guys. I wish Harriette well. I hope your recovery is speedy. I hope everybody has a wonderful holiday. Merry Christmas to those who celebrate Christmas and happy holidays to those that don't. I will see you next Friday. Everybody have a wonderful weekend. Oh,